pals, I'm here today to discuss my reaction to the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist for 2024. That's a bit of a mouthful. So it was quite chaotic for me because the Women's Prize over on Instagram do a live, which I think is certainly is pre-recorded, where they very briefly introduce the 16 books, and then at the end they put like a picture of the 16 books up. And usually when the Booker Prize or the Women's Prize gets announced, I sort of make sure that's an evening I'm free, I put it in my calendar, and I'm just sort of sitting there waiting to see what the long list is. But we had to sort of last minute look after our niece for an hour or so, and I was not going to turn that down because I absolutely love seeing my niece. She's 2.5 and she's just absolutely wonderful and a joy to spend time with. And so we went around to look after her, and yeah, I was just having loads of fun. And I suddenly realised it was 6 and I thought, I'm just going to put it on the background because I was just chatting away to her. So I put it on my phone on silent, and then when it got to, I didn't watch any of it, but when it got to the end where they just put the photo of the 16 books up, I really quickly grabbed a screenshot on my phone. And then when Johnny was chatting to our niece about something, I quickly went on the library app and just reserved as many of them as I could easily until we got home a couple of hours later. And then I properly looked into it and looked into what the books were actually about and tried to find the ones that it didn't look like my library had. So it was a little bit chaotic, and it was sort of an interesting one because there was this chaos in that I wasn't properly paying attention, and so I was having to just reserve loads more books than I was expecting because I'd read about 20 eligible books. I had about another 25 books on hold at the library that were eligible. So I was thinking surely I'm going to have covered it somewhat, and that wasn't the case. And then it was also chaotic in that this is the prize list out of any prize list I can ever think of that I was the least aware of. I think when you spend as much time in the bookish world as I do, sort of making plans for the channel, looking at new releases, watching so much other content, you have a fairly broad knowledge, not even just what you've read or what you feel like reading, but just all this other stuff that all these other people are reading. And so it was super shocking to see the long list and think, oh God, there's all these other books out there that I just haven't heard of. So yeah, it felt kind of chaotic, but sort of in a good way to me. So I know I will discuss more about the books and what my plans for them are, but just initially what I'll say is I guess some of the reaction has been, oh my God, there was all these amazing books that all these people were discussing their predictions videos and they've not made it, which I see and I get. But the flip side of that is there's all these books that we hadn't heard of that could still be amazing, right? We don't know. And also what I always try and bear in mind when I see these prize lists is the way they work is if an author has previously been, I think, shortlisted or won, their book is automatically submitted. So for example, we know that Tom Lake by Anne Patchett was submitted. The judges would have read it and they would have decided not to put it on the long list, okay? So that's the fact. But what we don't know is what other books were submitted, because publishers aren't just allowed to submit every eligible book, because if they did, the judges just don't have time to read that many books. So instead, each publisher, based on their size and I think their previous successes, are allowed to submit a certain amount of books. So for example, a really small publisher is usually only allocated one submission. So there's lots of books that we've all been speaking about in our videos, particularly from authors who haven't previously been on the long list, debut novels, authors who only have a second book out and have never been longlisted, that may not have even been submitted. The judges may never have even considered them. So it's really hard, I think, for us to, without seeing what was submitted to them, it's kind of hard for us to judge, which some prizes do release their submissions. The Booker Prize doesn't either. I really wish they would. I just think it's, people get so excited about these prizes and it would just be another step to see what books they'd read and which ones made the cut. But yeah, so I think that's always something to bear in mind, that we just don't know what they ended up reading. But I have a few things sort of written down that I wanted to just go over. The first one being, very embarrassingly, I didn't guess a single book correct in my predictions video. I thought I'd guessed one correct, but then I realised I hadn't actually included it as a prediction. I'd mentioned that I read it and loved it, and I would love to see it on the long list, but I didn't think it was a Women's Prize type book. I thought it was a book that would be more likely be seen on the Booker. And I think it may still be eligible for the Booker, so we may still see it there. Perhaps it would have been last year's. Anyway, I don't know. So I didn't guess a single book right, which is the worst I've ever done. I usually guess 2 or 3 right. I sort of assumed I'd probably only have read 2 of them at most, and I have read 2 of them, so that was sort of a guess correct. But yeah, I was hoping that with the books I'd read, and I'd read about 20 eligible books, and with the books I currently have up from the library and have on reserve, which is probably another 30 eligible books, that I would have covered it somewhat, and that's gone catastrophically wrong. So my TBR has just exploded. So yes, I will go through where I am with the long list and my thoughts on them. So, like I said, I didn't guess any correct, but I had mentioned Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan in my video as one I would happily see there. Thought it deserved to be on a lot of long lists, but it just felt more Booker Prize to me. The premise makes it sound like a thriller, and it is anything but a thriller. It's set in the 90s in London. You're following an Irish family, and the young daughter in the family, who's around 10, has been accused of murdering a much younger girl. And you are following a journalist who starts to interview the family to try and get sort of the gory details of this crime. And that makes it sound like it's going to be really thrillerish. And police procedural. It's really not. It's a really slow character study of this family, and I thought it was so intelligently done. So really happy to see that there. So as it stands, out of the 2 I've read, that would be my winner. The other one I've read, which I very nearly included on my long list, there's so many books to consider. There was loads of books that nearly made it. And one that nearly made it, which I saw lots of other people include, was Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy, which I've just read in the last few days and also very much enjoyed. It is about a new mother. She is soldier, her son is sailor, and she is writing the book to him. And it almost reads as though she's almost losing her mind, losing her sense of identity in this love for her son, and it's a wild ride. So I'm really happy to see that one there. Those are the 2 I read. The other one that I sort of considered including on my long list, and initially when I made my long list I did include it. I swapped it out for another book in the end because this is described as like a literary horror, and I just couldn't remember if I'd ever seen a horror book make the Women's Prize long list, so I took it off. And that this year it feels like they maybe have gone a little bit more into genre than the Women's Prize usually do. So we have And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott, which is the one that I considered including. And then we also have a sci-fi novel, which I'll talk about later. So I've read Alicia Elliott's first book, which is an essay collection called A Mind Spread Out on the Ground. She is a Mohawk writer based in Canada, and that essay collection is a super interesting exploration of what it is like to be an Indigenous person in North America, and tied up with lots of questions about sort of sexism, gender, and in particular mental health, struggles with depression. And this book is also about a new mother who is really struggling, but she is married to a white man who studies her culture, and she believes that something sort of insidious is going on with her neighbours. They're being really racist towards her. Her husband completely gaslights her about that, and she starts to believe that something is after her and her child. And I think she sort of believes that she could be saved by part of her Mohawk tradition and sort of cultural history. So I think it sounds really interesting. I've had it out of the library for about 3 months, so I now need to get a wiggle on and read it so I can return it for all the other people who will have just added it to their TBR. So I'm super happy to see that one there. I always feel quite disappointed by all the long lists we see, in particular outside of the US, that just don't include Indigenous writers. And so yeah, really happy to see this one make it. Then there's 4 other books I'd heard of, as in I'd heard of the book, I'd heard of the author. One of those is The Wren by Anne Enright. This is like a sort of mother-daughter story. I've never read any Anne Enright. I'm sort of willing to read that one. It sounds interesting enough. It has multiple narrators on audio, so that's one I might listen to on audio. Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad is one I stumbled across in a bookshop when it first came out, and I thought it sounded really interesting. And then I actually asked my library to buy it and then didn't get around to reading it. And I've heard many people review it and say it's really good since then. Interestingly, when I saw lots of people include this in their predictions, they said, oh, you know, the Women's Prize might sort of go political and include this because part of the book takes place in Palestine, and it's about a Palestinian character who I think is putting on a production of Hamlet. And people thought they may avoid it because it would lean too political. But I guess without having read this book, I my feelings are that they could be going political with including it, but I guess I don't want the author to hear that and feel like people are saying, well, it's just there because of the political aspect, because I'm sure it's also there or just there because they thought it was, you know, one of the best of the books they read. So yeah, I don't want to like narrow this book down to only being there as like a political gesture, if that makes sense. I think it sounds really interesting. Looking forward to reading that one. Then the only one on the list that I DNF'd was Western Lane by Chetna Maru. I previously picked this up because of the book along list. I gave up with the book along list because I just really didn't enjoy it. But I was having quite a rough time at the time and was really struggling with reading books that I wasn't loving. So I got about a third of the way through. This is so short, so I think I'll attempt it again. I like books about young girls coming of age. I like books about grief. Don't like books about squash. And then we have Night Bloom by Peace Adzo Mehdi. Now this is an interesting one because based on the premise, I would definitely want to read this, and I saw a few people include this in their predictions video. Premise is that we're following these two Ghanaian women who are cousins, but they are so close they act like sisters. And they grow up together. Something happens that fractures their relationship. I think one of them perhaps stays in Ghana and one moves to the US. And then something's happening in the sort of present day when they are adults that draws them back together. I love those type of stories. I love any story that centres sort of friendships or familiar relationships between women. I love stories about immigration, particularly when one person stays and one person leaves. I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I just really like the way this is described. However, what have been putting me off about this one is the cover that I have up here that you are currently seeing. I'm not a massive fan of covers like this. I think they lean towards young adult or like rom-com type books. When I see a book like that, I assume it's more commercial leaning than it is literary. So I saw that cover and just thought, the premise sounds interesting, but maybe this one isn't for me. Then I saw the cover that I'm now putting up that the Women's Prize included in their video. Now I think this is the US cover. I could be wrong here. It's a very different cover and I very much like it. And this cover paired with the blurb make me want to read it. That makes me sound super shallow, but I think, you know, books have pretty covers for a reason, and that's because those covers tell you something about the content. And yeah, so these two covers appear to be giving me a very different book. But this is one that I'm, out of all the like blurbs, this is one of the ones I'm the most pulled to, but more pulled to with the floral cover. So there's that one. So those are the books that I was aware of. And then there's two books where I was aware of the author, but not the books themselves. One of those is The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. I was super surprised to see this on there. I've been aware of Karen Lord for a while, and funnily enough, I've had like online TBRs for as long as I've had this channel, so about 11 years. And one of the books that has stayed on those online TBRs for the longest, bearing in mind I regularly cull it and like, you know, I need to reduce this, there's hundreds on here. One of them that survived the longest and hasn't been removed and hasn't been read is Redemption and Indigo by Karen Lord, which is a really celebrated sci-fi book that I think has a lot of inspiration from the author's heritage. She's an author based in Barbados, I believe. And yeah, I've heard amazing things about it and never got around to reading it because I'm awful at picking sci-fi books up. So when I heard that one of her sci-fi books had made the longlist, I was like, this is like really, yeah, unique. You know, fairly often we see like dystopian type books make these long lists, but not necessarily full out sci-fi. I believe this is like a full out sci-fi book. I'm slightly anxious about this one for two reasons. I'm super happy to be picking up a Karen Lord book. Super happy to be like pulled to read a sci-fi. Love the fact that I think it's leaning into like climate change fiction and talking about the way we're destroying the earth, so I'm really happy for that. However, I'm pretty sure this is the third book set in like a world Karen Lord is creating. So I don't think you have to have read the previous two, and in fact I expect the judges haven't. But I think the story is richer if you have, because you already know this world and some of the like political, context for this world. So that makes me a tiny bit anxious. And then the other thing is that when I continue to read the blurb, it says something like one of the weapons of these nations is this pop singer. And that sounds just a bit too comedic for me as a reader. And so, yeah, everything else about the blurb I was like into until I saw that bit. So this is one that I'm like, have a little, you know, asterisk in my mind as to whether this will work for me. But I'm still pretty happy to see it there. I think it's exciting to see a book from a sci-fi author on the list. And the other author I'd heard of, but I wasn't aware of this new book, is Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. My understanding is that Kate Grenville is an Australian author, and this is a book that is, I think, historical, set in maybe the late 1800s, about a woman who is restless, and she lives in the Australian countryside, and yeah, she sort of wants to make more of her life. And it sounds like it is, yeah, like a slow story following her journey to have a different life. Not super interested in this one. This is the type of book, when I see this type of cover, I just think it looks like a kind of twee, heartwarming book that a sort of dime a dozen, and I'm not that inspired to pick it up. So this is one of the ones on the list that I'm the least excited about. But the fact that it's made it hopefully means that it is like, you know, the best of those type of books. We shall see. So yeah, there's that one. Now we're on to all the ones that I had never heard of the author, never heard of the book. And like I said, this is, you know, a fair amount on a long list for me to not to have heard of. Usually there's 3 or 4 books I've not heard of. This is about half the list. So yeah, I just feel like they've gone really left field with this in terms of there were so many more well-known books that could have made it. And like I said, quite a few of these are from small presses or debut authors. So yeah, I'm intrigued. So one of them is Hangman by Maya Binyam. This is one of the ones I think I'm the least likely to enjoy, because I think it is slightly, it's described as a sort of satirical tragicomedy. Those are 2 things that I do not get on with. It is about a man who gets on a flight to sub-Saharan Africa, and a man meets him at the airport and says he's his brother, but is he? And he sort of goes on this journey with him. I'm always less excited about any books included on the Woman's Prize that are told from a man's perspective, and I don't really enjoy satire. Any book that has comedy in it, I'm always a bit wary of, because, you know, I think tastes in comedy are so specific, it's really hard to get right. So this is one of the ones I'm sort of expecting to not enjoy, just because of my personal tastes. Then In Defence of the Act, never heard of this one. This one looks like quite a short one, and it is about a woman who studies the idea of suicide, and she defends the act. She thinks it's a very selfless thing to do, and then something happens that makes her start to question that. This sounds really different to the type of books I'm used to seeing on the Woman's Prize. So yeah, I'm sort of intrigued by this. I have no idea where it's going to go and like where it's going to be tonally, but yeah, I'm intrigued. Then we have The Maiden by Kate Foster. This is another one of the ones I see this cover and I just think, God, we've seen this cover a gazillion times, and I'm completely uninterested. And, you know, this is a historical novel set, I think, in Edinburgh. It is about a woman who is condemned to death because she is accused of being a murderess, and it's about whether she did it or not. I think it's perhaps based on a true story. I think we've had a fair amount of books that have done this now. Most famously, we had Alias Grace and Burial Rites. And yeah, I would definitely not pick this book up based on the cover and the premise. The thing is, when I love this type of historical fiction, I really love it. I love all of Sarah Waters' books, and they are some of my favourite books of all time, but I think there is so much filler in this type of sort of historical fiction genre that I think it's really hard sometimes to sort of dig through the weeds to get to the good ones. So yeah, again, this and the Kate Grenville I sort of would pair together as being some of the ones I'm least interested in. And yeah, just feel a bit uninspired by. Then we have Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshanathan. This is a Sri Lankan novel, and I think this follows a young woman as she grows up in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. And I think it says in the blurb that several of her brothers die one after another, which makes me think of the sort of memoir in essays, Men We Reap by Jesmond Ward, which is about several young men, including one of her brothers, who died around her. and sort of the commentary on why that would have happened. I mean, I loved that memoir. So yeah, I think this sounds really interesting. I haven't read many books that take place in Sri Lanka, and this is one of those books that is entirely down to the writing. I can super enjoy these type of stories if they're written in a way that works for me. I also think these type of stories can be written in a way that has a tiny bit of distance. However, this is another one that I've checked, and it is available on audio. It has several narrators, and I listened to the sample, and I felt that the sample, I sort of immediately felt quite warmed to the character narrating, and it was first person, which I prefer in this type of book. So yeah, I am feeling quite hopeful for this one. Right, we're down to the last three. So we have 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster by Marina Lee. I wouldn't have picked this book up based on the cover and the title. I think the cover has the word spy on it. That makes me think of espionage. The cover looks a bit like it could have like espionage thriller type elements to it, which it interests me like not at all. But I think the premise of this is that it is an older woman telling her stories in an old people's home, and the listener can't believe that all these stories of her life could be about the same person, because it crosses such a vast expanse of time and follows her across many different countries. So I think through this woman's story, we'll see like the history of many nations, and I like that the Woman's Prize uplifts stories that are historical in nature and tend to cover lots of conflict, but focus really narrowly on a sort of woman's experience during those periods of conflict, which isn't what we're usually talking about when we sort of see these stories on the news. So yeah, I am unsure about this one. I like the idea of her telling these stories as an older lady. I like the idea of it being a story about women, but unsure about the spy aspect and whether we'll feel sort of held at a distance because we're crossing so many years in one book. Then we have River East, River West by Aubrey Lescure. I would have thought this was a dystopian based on the cover. The colours look like fire colours and the buildings look a bit dystopian. It's not a dystopian novel. This is a story about a young girl coming of age in Shanghai, and her mother is marrying their landlord, and she really doesn't want that to happen, so she's trying to thwart it, I think. And then there's a dual narrative. We also hear her sort of stepdad's perspective in the 1980s, and yeah, sort of see his story. I love coming of age stories. I feel less interested obviously in the man's perspective, but I would have picked this one up if I'd have heard of it before the long list was announced. And lastly, we have A Trace of Sun by Pam Williams. Now I think this is the one on the list that is one of the least well known. It's from a really small press. I think the cover is entirely uninspiring. I think it looks like it's come from a small press that don't have a ton of money to spend on things like the production, which I think is, a shame. But I also think that means it's really nice that the Women's Prize has longlisted it, because I think it will get a lot more readers. And this is one of the ones I'm most interested in based on premise. This is about a mother who leaves her son behind in Grenada to come to the UK, I think as part of the Windrush generation. And she comes to the UK to be with her husband. And then I think 6 or 7 years later, her son comes to the UK with them. And their relationship is completely broken by the distance of those years, and it's about her trying to fix that. And yeah, I think that sounds really interesting. I enjoy, as someone who doesn't want to be a mother, I enjoy stories about motherhood and about a mother's relationship with their children. I'm always happy to see more stories about the Windrush generation be spoken about, and yeah, I'm really excited for this one. So overall, I am more excited than not. Am I disappointed that loads of books I loved and loads of books I was already planning to read haven't made it? Yes. But did I look into all the books I hadn't heard of and think, oh, these all sound shit? No. I actually thought that quite a lot of them sounded like they could be really interesting. And one thing I'll say as a massive plus is that so often I see these long lists, and I'm not just talking about the Women's Prize, I'm talking about any long list of fiction, and I think, it's the 21st century and it's still majority white authors, and it's still majority set in the US and the UK, and it's boring. There's all these other stories. If these prizes aren't to uplift us and get us to read different stories, then I don't know what is. And so I'm thankful that for once we have a long list that is where white authors are in the minority, and we're traveling the world. There's so many different countries featured in these books There is Ireland, Palestine, Ghana, Grenada, China, Australia, Sri Lanka, Sub-Saharan Africa, Scotland, US, Canada, and then we have a sci-fi that's written by a writer from Barbados. So just such a great mix. And we have a sci-fi book, a horror, a few historical fiction, satire. So yeah, I feel that it's exciting in terms of, I don't feel like I'm now about to read loads of the same stories, right? I'm really intrigued by all the different countries we're going to spend time in, and yeah, I feel pretty happy with this list. I'm planning to read them all. I'm planning to even give Western Lane another go. I haven't decided at this point if I will allow myself to DNF. I guess it depends how much I start disliking these books. Like I said, I've read 2 of them. I have one of them out from the library. 9 my library had, so I've put on hold, and I'm first in the queue for most of them, except for the Anne Wright. And I had to ask my library to buy 4 of the others because they didn't have them. But there's a few of these that I think I will perhaps go the audio route because they have multiple narrators, and I tend to like reading books that are set in other countries via audio because I'm really bad at imagining an accent in my head. So for example, I'm probably going to listen to Night Bloom, Brotherless Night and The Wren via audio because they all have multiple voice actors, which is just something I really enjoy. So that's the plan. I think we have 7 weeks and I need to read 14 books. So if I read 2 a week, I'll manage it. I also have loads of other books I want to read. So we shall see. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on the long list. And I would love to know what your plans are. I would say that overall, I feel more positive than I expected to. I always go in and really lower my expectations because the last few years I've got my hopes up and then been like, ugh. And there's nothing on the list that I feel completely ugh about. There's a couple of books that I think, oh, I'm not massively into satire, not sure how I'm going to do with that. There's a couple of books that I just feel a bit uninspired by, the Restless Dolly Maunder and the Maiden, but I also feel like, I won't entirely hate them, and I could be surprised. I'm like willing with all of these books to be surprised. So yeah, thanks for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts down below and I will see you in the next video. Bye.